spearheaded the Beverly Hills Cultural Heritage Commission to honor the city's rich history and architectural legacy. Mirisch has served as mayor 3 times in 2013, 2016, and 2019. He is a firm believer that local government, when done right, is the best form of democracy because it is closest to the people. Mirisch has worked with other like-minded elected officials throughout California to vigorously safeguard communities by protecting local rights from the incursions of the state government and special interest groups. Mirisch is a vocal opponent of degrading local government authority to determine residential zoning, leading him to boldly go into political trenches where few dare, Twitter, and led him into direct conflict with YIMBY activists. The title we came up with for his talk tonight is Anti-Housing Speculation Policies and Solutions for American Cities and the Fantasy of Endless Growth. But who knows what he may talk about. Friends, let's give us a warm Boulder welcome to John Mirisch.
Thank you. To Ashley's point, it's all about the money. It's all about the money. But before I get into details and into some haphazardly prepared remarks, an attempt to tell a story in which the communitarians are the good guys in a David versus Goliath battle for the soul of cities against the urban growth machine and corporate greed. I'd like to thank Peter and PLAN-Boulder for the invitation. I'm honored to be here in your community, and I look forward in the next couple of days to actually getting a chance to experience some of it. And at least for tomorrow, go Colorado. I'd also like to congratulate the honorees, and I will tell a little bit before I get into my prepared remarks about where I'm coming from. But first I want to say that the Beverly Hills and Boulder may be closer than you think. In fact, probably few of you know, and little did I know until recently, that Ashley's father is a fellow Norman who graduated from Beverly Hills High School along with myself, not the same year, but so Ashley has Beverly Hills roots, and I've always said there's not 6 degrees of separation, and it's probably the same in Boulder. There's maybe 1.5 degrees. Now, I grew up in Beverly Hills. I'm a 4th-generation resident. I went to Beverly Hills High School, and like many people who grew up in Beverly Hills, we like to think of our community as Mayberry. At a National League of Cities meeting, I met someone from North Carolina where Andy Griffith was from, and they're like, no, we're Mayberry. But actually, the Andy Griffith show, Mayberry, was filmed in Franklin Canyon, very close to Beverly Hills. I go hiking there a lot. But really, isn't that what each community thinks about themselves? I'm sure there are people in Boulder and communities around here that think of themselves as Mayberry. And on our best days, we are. As another resident has said, on our worst days in Beverly Hills, we're like Peyton Place in an Ibsen play. But that's all communities as well. Now, Peter mentioned as well that I worked in Austria. I spent 5 years there. That's relevant in the subject matter of housing. A lot of you will have heard of Viennese-style housing. Well, I actually lived there for 5 years. I feel well equipped to talk about it. Probably not tonight unless there's some questions afterwards. And Sweden, I spent more than that. And I am actually a Swedish citizen as well. And many of my views on politics, on community, and on other things are actually very, very Swedish, whether it comes to nature, whether it comes to income inequality, whether it comes to community itself. Sweden really has a sense that we're all in this together, and contrasted with much of America's rugged individualism. Now, there are a few things that Sweden could learn from America, but there are a lot more things that America can and should learn from Sweden. And I will say that in my years of public service, I've always somehow in the background have that Swedish mentality and thinking about how would they do it in Sweden. I'm also, in addition to serving on the City Council of Beverly Hills in a number of regional commissions and that sort of thing, one of the most relevant and important is recently the state created an agency called La CASA, the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency. It's an agency created by the state, sadly without funding, but that's pretty typical for the state. And our goal is to preserve, produce, and affordable housing and also protect tenants. And we're not a homelessness agency. We have that in Los Angeles County. We've taxed ourselves with something called Measure H. That's LASA, we're La CASA. But our goal is to create significant amounts of affordable housing to prevent people from falling into homelessness. And you will hear that I'm somebody who thinks that the best way to create affordable housing is to get state funding, to get subsidies, to do it, rather than to build mass quantities of luxury housing and hope that it trickles down, which is the YIMBY position. And I will get to that in a bit. I'm also a member of a group called CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. And one of your board members, Gary, is also a member. And basically, it is a form of recognizing that we live in a planet that has planetary limits. And that fellow Swede, Greta Thunberg, once said, here we are at the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can do is think about money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. Well, we at CASI feel that those are fairy tales. We need to figure out another way, and that way is the steady state economy. I'm not going to get into great detail about that now, but it's basically suggesting there are limits to growth, and we need to acknowledge them. Finally, I'm a communitarian. I believe in the power of communities. I believe that communities are where we live. I believe that communities are an extension of family and an extension of home, and that home is a sacred place. And whether it's Boulder or Baldwin Hills or Beverly Hills or wherever, we feel, and we should feel, a sense of connection with where we live, a sense of rootedness and a sense of connectedness through place to each other. And this is something that these YIMBY groups, who I will soon refer to as WIMBY, and you will hear why, ignore. They feel we should be able to move at the drop of a hat. They don't feel we should be connected to a place. They feel we should be mobile in accordance with the needs and the dictates of capital. And I disagree with them. Finally, I just want to, Peter mentioned something about fighting greed or corporate greed, and I just want to mention one thing before I get into my remarks. I mentioned a David and Goliath story, and this one may give hope that in our other David and Goliath stories, there is actually a bit of hope that together we may be able to achieve something. So, the world's richest man at the time, it's now Elon Musk, but at the time, this was a few months ago, it was Bernard Arnault. Bernard Arnault is a French billionaire who owns Louis Vuitton, Moet Chandon. He bought a piece of property in Beverly Hills, and he owns a lot, and he wanted to build a luxury hotel. And nothing wrong with that. Hotels are good sources of revenue. But he basically hired ex-mayor lobbyists, he hired ex-commissioners, he hired basically everyone in the city to try and convince us what a wonderful thing this would be. Now, the project itself was okay, but the worst thing about it was the way that this was almost supposed to be a rubber stamp of the council. And in fact, the council voted 4-1 to approve it. I was the lone dissenting vote. My major problem with that was, here you have a hotel that's going to have an average nightly cost of over $2,000. And my feeling was, you know what, these are among the richest of the rich people. Let's add, in addition to the other fees and taxes that we have, an incremental amount of 5%. On a $2,000 a night hotel rate, that's $100. That should go to a fund for affordable housing. The richest can afford to pay so that those who are most vulnerable among us can hopefully have a place where they can live. This was something that Arnault or his people were not willing to discuss. My council colleagues were not willing to discuss. It was just slammed through. Now, one of the unions, the hotel union, and they probably had their own causes and their own reasons, but they were able to go and gather signatures, and this went on the ballot. for the residents to vote. And despite all the false narratives that this is just outsiders who are trying to influence our election, think of it. The hotel workers in our city are outsiders, but the world's richest man who lives in France is an insider. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I was the only one to speak out against it, and I wrote one of the ballot statements against it, and they ended up spending over $4 million. We have 35,000 residents in Beverly Hills. We have 22,000 voters. And you should have seen they had TV ads. They had constant barrage of, it was cable TV. They had a constant barrage of advertising in the newspapers and everywhere. They had door knockers. The union did their share, and then we had a group of residents who just went door to door and who wrote materials and handed them out on flyers. We were outspent 20-1, something like that. But when the election happened, and this was in May, end of May, on election night, the no side, meaning our side, was ahead by maybe 100 votes. Now, it's interesting in California because of our election laws, votes keep coming in for weeks and weeks and weeks. And we thought they were going to find votes. They did gain somewhat, but at the end of the day, despite challenging it and asking for a recount at our county registrar, the no side prevailed. David beat Goliath. We literally beat the world's richest man. Now, I don't know if that's the reason that he's no longer the world's richest and it's Elon Musk, but I do know that he paid close attention to it, and I would not have liked to have been the person to say, Monsieur Arnaud, we have some news for you. But the point is, next time, hopefully, when a project like that comes to us, instead of just saying, oh no, we're not prepared to do it, maybe they would have been better advised to say, you know what, that makes sense. And we're not paying it ourselves, our hotel guests are. We'll allow that, and that would have provided much needed funds for affordable housing. I think that is a good model. We had another project which was approved, and it's a multi-billion-dollar luxury condo project. And there, the average condo is going to cost over $13 million. These are not empty nesters in Beverly Hills who are then moving from their home to there. These are people who are speculators or people who are parking money or laundering money. And unfortunately, I didn't get my way to have an additional 2% documentary transfer tax, again, going to a fund for affordable housing, which we need. As I just mentioned to you, the state, despite creating La Casa, our affordable housing solutions agency, saw fit to fund it with nothing, with bupkis. One other thing I did want to say is that, as some of you will have noticed, I'm also proudly Jewish. And Beverly Hills is interesting in that Beverly Hills is one of the few Jewish majority communities outside of Israel. We have 11 elected officials, 10 of which are Jewish. One is married to a Jewish person. And so this is something growing up in a world with growing anti-Semitism. And by the way, that's why I'm wearing my kippah, because I am proud of being Jewish and I want everyone to know that. Is something that is also very unique about our community. People don't think of it, but Beverly Hills is actually a minority-majority community, with many of our residents who are the children of Holocaust survivors and many who escaped the regime in Iran. So that's something just to know about our community that not a lot of people know, because most people don't associate our community with Mayberry. They may think more of the Beverly Hillbillies or something like that. So now to my remarks, which I hope you will find relevant to Boulder. In the Tales of the Hasidim, Martin Buber, the Austrian philosopher, relates the tale of Rabbi Zusia. Before his death, Rabbi Zusia said, "In the coming world, if they shall ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' I shall have an answer. But if they ask me, 'Why were you not Zusia?' I will be left with no reply." We've heard from the Supreme Court and from some politicians that corporations are people, my friend. And I couldn't disagree with this more. It's a ridiculous proposition, just as ridiculous as the notion that money is speech. And until we get rid of two of the worst Supreme Court rulings since the Dred Scott decision, money will continue to pollute and infest and corrupt our political system in every manner imaginable. In the New Testament, for our Christian friends, Timothy 6:10, we hear that, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." And sadly, these words also perfectly describe our own flawed political system. In a democracy, in a true marketplace of ideas, it's those with the best ideas who should win the day, not those with the biggest megaphones, not those with the most megaphones. While the Supreme Court seems to feel our system was not designed to create a level playing field, without a level playing field, we can never truly fulfill our potential as a nation. If corporations are not people, if they are not living, breathing organisms, it is a very different situation with our communities. It would be far more appropriate to compare a community, a city like my Beverly Hills or your Boulder, with a human being. While a corporation has one goal and one goal only, namely to turn a profit, cities are where we make our lives. Cities are our home. Cities encompass the entire spectrum of human endeavor, and so we are connected with the cities, in this case Boulder, your home, in a very, very different way. We are all Rabbi Zusia, and so is your beloved hometown, Boulder. And the question, why is Boulder not New York or Dubai or Coral Gables or Hong Kong or Beverly Hills, is a question we can probably answer if we want to, but it's not really a question that we need to ask. The real question we should be asking ourselves, like Rabbi Zusia, is why are we not being Boulder in your case, or in my city, Beverly Hills? The trick is working to remember what the potential of our special places are, and to always ask ourselves what we can do to be a better first-rate Boulder or Beverly Hills, and not a second-rate Manhattan or London or Milan. When we look at the development and growth of cities and urban areas, we can well continue to use the metaphor that the city is like a human being. It's a very fitting metaphor, in fact. Each one of us has a God-given potential, and each of our potentials is in some way unique to us. One size rarely fits all. And as we grow into adulthood and try to reach our ideal sizes and heights and weights, we should exercise, eat nutritiously, and live a healthy lifestyle to achieve our peak potential. But if, after we have grown into our ideal size and height and weight, we continue to try to force ourselves to grow by continuing to eat indiscriminately, by continuing to stuff our throats because we somehow think that growth per se is good, we will eventually become bloated and our arteries will become clogged. And so it is with cities when they misuse land planning principles and allow unbridled development. As we see in so many places, the arteries of our cities are quite literally becoming clogged. Now, I don't know if Rabbi Zusia was interested in wonky politics in his day, but when it comes to local land use planning and the future of cities, many of our politicians seem to want to take a top-down approach. Presidents back from Obama to Biden have weighed in making statements which seem to suggest that it should be easier for developers to densify across the board, with less local control for communities to try to determine what works for them to ensure their and our quality of life. Personally, I've heard similar rhetoric from your Senator Bennett when he visited my son's school in Westwood, and I understand Governor Polis is also on the same density train. Well, we absolutely need to look at solutions to the housing crisis. In my opinion, we need less Big Brother and more local decision-making. Local government, as Peter mentioned, this is almost my motto and my credo, local government, if done correctly, is the best form of democracy. It's closest to home, and home is a sacred place. Communities should be able to decide for themselves what kind of development they feel is appropriate for their residents, for their own vision of the future, and they should not be forced into models which don't allow them to fill their unique individual potential. Once again, this being Friday, so Shabbat Shalom, the good book gives good advice. In Ecclesiastes 3, we read, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. And if I may add myself, a time and a place to densify, and a time and a place to let it be." If I may talk a little bit about what's happening in California, which probably is fairly similar to what's happening here and to the rest of the country, as I hear from my colleagues when I go to meetings like at the National League of Cities, which sometimes feels like group therapy when each of us from our various states talks about what's happening. Red, blue, old, new, it's all the same. But an article, I'd like to refer to an article that was in the LA Daily News in which Chapman University urban fellow Joel Kotkin writes about, quote, "how to make post-suburbanism work." Now, Joel and I disagree on a number of things, including the subject of economic growth itself. But this is an insightful and a courageous article from which I'm now going to quote at length because it is so relevant to what I've been saying and to what I was planning to say. Writes Kotkin, quote, "Our cognitive elites dislike the very idea that Los Angeles, as Dorothy Parker once supposedly described, has long been 72 suburbs in search of a city. Yet Southern California, as I discuss in a new Chapman University report, has from its early emergence grown around a post-suburban model of dynamic, smaller clusters. This urban form has become common in many major metropolitan areas as automobiles have replaced transit as the primary means of getting around. This model worked here brilliantly for most of the last half-century, until planners, real estate speculators, and California bureaucrats decided that we needed to emulate New York City and other monocentric core cities. Like the provincials they consistently prove themselves to be, our leaders have generally complied. So after nearly 15 years spent in pushing this direction, what have we accomplished? A transit system that barely serves as many people as it did before we started building trains. Housing prices among the highest in the nation, super high poverty rates, and a population that continues to seek to go somewhere else, including some 1.6 million net domestic migrants who have left the LA and Orange County area since 2000. Now I'm adding as a parenthetical myself, with the most recent Department of Finance projections, California, the whole state, including LA County, is projected to lose 1.7 million residents through 2060. But I will tell you, as opposed to some of the people who are wailing that this is an awful thing, this is actually a good thing, and it is an opportunity for a state with almost 40 million people. Back to Joel. Some see densification as necessary to meet the demands of an expanding population. Yet both LA and OC's populations are growing slower than both the state and national average, nor has the pro-density regime relieved any of the pressure on housing and rent. The advocates of the new dense Los Angeles have stirred opposition throughout the region. True, some of those objecting to new growth may be too concerned with preserving the past, but many others, including some in Los Angeles, have rightly concluded that the region's once splendid quality of life is being consciously undermined by planners, politicians, and their real estate paymasters. End quote. Kotkin hits the nail on the head in this article. We might well ask ourselves, perhaps mixing holiday metaphors, why is Southern California different from other regions? You could probably ask yourself the same thing about the Denver and Boulder region. Kotkin correctly recognizes that our urban model is in many ways organically unique compared to other cities. The fact that planners, politicians, and their real estate paymasters are focusing on the density chimera as an urban planning silver bullet proves they really don't understand California or many of the other areas where they are trying to make this same silver bullet prescription. And they most certainly don't understand Martin Buber's Rabbi Zusia parable or the Ecclesiastes quote about a time and place, my embellishment for everything. Not surprisingly, the density mirage, as Kotkin calls it, has created a backlash. And the people who question forced density as fairy tales of eternal economic growth are badmouthed as NIMBYs, Malthusians, or worse, by our WIMBY friends. Now, what is a WIMBY? LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, who is legendary in our region, who served on the LA City Council, once correctly in a planning report said that the so-called YIMBYs are really WIMBYs, meaning Wall Street in my backyard. And to me, as I said, it's all about the money, and you will pardon my usage. I don't think that YIMBYs exist, but WIMBYs do. So when I say WIMBY, you'll know what I mean. Now, interestingly enough, in all of the discussions in which indiscriminate densification is seen as a solution to all our housing problems, there's one critical question that nobody asks. President Obama didn't, Trump didn't, Biden didn't. I'm guessing Governor Polis didn't either. And yet it's perhaps the most important question we can ask, and we need to ask it. What is the end game? Yes, what is the end game? Where does it end? Okay, let's say we do densify according to these half-baked patchwork plans, which are undergirded by market fundamentalism and radical libertarian dogma. Not very progressive, actually. Just look at your neighbors a couple of states over in Montana at the Frontier Institute. Just look at them. Indeed, the proposed densification model almost assumes an endless spiral of growth. But why are we not instead talking about sustainability? True sustainability. We talk about it in almost every other context: energy policy, water usage, agriculture, you name it. Why not in urban planning? Isn't an endless spiral of densification the very definition of unsustainability? The densification efforts supported by our politicians, President Biden, my governor, Governor Newsom, who is also evidently a presidential candidate in waiting, and of course, Governor Polis, and all the other diverse members of what I'll call the developer construction industrial complex have presented a solution, and yes, I'm putting the word in quotation marks, which is essentially a trickle-down theory of housing, because almost all of the new dense housing being constructed is luxury, high-end housing. I will note not a little bit of irony in the warm embrace of what was a central tenet of Reaganomics by just these politicians. And by the way, and here's an interesting fact, Kotkin points out that all high-density housing, not just the luxury variety, is actually more expensive to construct. But the big problem with the trickle-down theory of housing and densification is not the ideological irony. It's that it doesn't work. Vacancy rates in LA County of luxury housing remain at 10 to 20% or more, while regular housing rates are much lower and affordable housing rates lower than that. We see similar patterns throughout the nation. In transportation, there's a theory of induced demand. Essentially, the theory says that if we add lanes to a freeway, traffic will not improve because the additional capacity will attract more vehicles. It's kind of like water seeking its own level. Now, one could make a similar case about the construction of more housing, luxury or affordable housing. While as mentioned, we desperately do need more affordable housing, and we need a lot more of it than we need more market rate housing. As a member of the La Casa board, this is my focus. But let's face it, Southern California can be a great place to live, and so is Colorado. Think about it. We have great weather, something those of us who have ever lived in colder climates like Sweden will ever take for granted. There's not a wall around Southern California or Colorado. It's not a closed ecosystem. So in theory, if a glut of affordable housing becomes available, we might attract people from around the country who would love to live here. Luxury housing itself can induce demand by gentrifying a neighborhood and then we're back to square one with an increased demand on our collective infrastructure, transportation, water, and everything else. Yes, that's also a logical example of inducing demand, though urban planners with their blinders on it have been ignoring it. So it all goes back to the question about the end game, which no urban planners seem to want to talk about. What will my region, what will your region look like in 50 years or in 100 years? What should it look like? We're great at a lot of things in our country, but long-term thinking often doesn't seem to be one of them, whether it's corporate America or American politics. While some growth within a region may be inevitable and some more than others, whether we like it or not, everyone in the entire world cannot move to Colorado, can't move to Southern California. And not everyone wants to. Not everyone should. Opportunity shouldn't be concentrated in a few superstar cities. As we say in Sweden, hela landet ska leva, which means the whole country should thrive. And actually, Sweden has a great set of policies to ensure that anywhere in Sweden is livable and is a great place to live, not just Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. Broadband is one of them. Remote work is one of them. But a combination of housing subsidies and rent control might be able to ensure a continued diverse mix of residents within my county, along with, and I'll get to this in a bit too, anti-speculation housing policies, and probably would work here. While the let's build it densification espoused by the politicians who incorrectly feel we can build our way out of housing shortages actually can lead to displacement and gentrification. So instead of, as I wrote in an article, I'll note that the word density does not rhyme with sanity. In California, at least, many big cities are becoming increasingly unlivable as population continues to concentrate, traffic gets worse, and housing costs soar. Not a lot of disagreement there. And yet it feels like there's something in the Kool-Aid of many editorial boards and op-ed writers which make them take a shine to SB 50 or a follow-up bill, SB 43, which actually today just passed our assembly, and it would expand SB 50, which basically takes away local planning and puts the urban growth machine in control of our cities. There are a barrage of bills like that in California. In the last 3 years, there have been close to, I believe, 200 housing bills, many of which are actually real estate bills. And as said, editorial boards of the LA Times and San Francisco Chronicle and other newspapers which have a history of real estate boosterism love them all. These are Sacramento and probably also, I understand, Denver's latest schemes to fix things, but they do nothing of the sort. They actually will make the problem worse. And so even out-of-state newspapers like the New York Times have showered praise upon this legislation as bold and has given the publicity-loving, wimpy politicians like Scott Wiener, who some of you may have heard about, who was the author of some of these bills, plenty of column inches. In one such piece, America's cities are unlivable, blame wealthy liberals, New York Times author Farhad Manjoo takes aim at those opposed to these community-destroying bills, including my city. He writes, "Yet where progressives argue for openness and inclusion as a cudgel against President Trump at the time of the article, they abandon it on Nob Hill and in Beverly Hills. This explains the opposition to SB 50, which aimed to address the housing shortage in a very straightforward way by building more housing," unquote. Well, this may simply be the after effect of a Kool-Aid hangover, but does anyone really think it's that simple? Does anyone really think that building more Porsches is going to bring down the price of Priuses? Has Manhattan's density helped create any kind of meaningful housing affordability? Has Manjoo even looked at vacancy levels for luxury housing or the impact global capital has on displacement and gentrification? While Manjoo decries the steady collapse of livability, like the Wimbys in Wall Street, he looks to even greater density to save the day. He writes, "Metropolises are good for the psyche and the soul. Density fosters tolerance, diversity, creativity, and progress." Well, yes, maybe for some, and maybe in some ways, but this is hardly an absolute, and largely a matter of personal preference. WIMBYs who are quick to point out the racist history of some single-family communities, a history which Beverly Hills, now as a Jewish-majority city, has managed to overcome. They're also quick to forget the racist, oppressive history of forced density, otherwise known as tenements and slums. Maybe it's time for some of them to bone up on their Jacob Riis. Maybe some of them should probably read Georg Simmel and others who write about the psychological effects of density. Maybe it's time to look at the actual living and housing preferences of a vast majority of Americans of all stripes. And guess what? There have been studies, even those done by WIMBYs themselves, such as one done by Jessica Traunstein called You Won't Be My Neighbor, where it's very clear that the preference of most Americans is not small to mid-sized, densely packed apartments. Guess what it is? Across every category and by a large majority, it's single-family neighborhoods. That's just the way it is. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose are already the 3 densest urban areas in the U.S. New York is number 4, urban area, not just Manhattan. So it's hard to see how more forced density is going to make anything more livable, let alone create some kind of mythical affordability. Just where does the gospel that bigger is always better come from? Far from being progressive, the obsession with a never-ending spiral of growth seems to be something else entirely. Economist Kenneth Boulding once wrote, "Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist." We might well add Sacramento or Denver politician and self-styled progressive opinion editor to that list. It truly seems as if there's Kool-Aid in the Kool-Aid. Because when people correctly identify income inequality as a root cause of our nation's housing challenges, why would they seriously entertain a solution which puts Wall Street in the driver's seat? With its "the market will solve our housing crisis" premise, which is exactly what all of these bills do, or most of them, it's hardly surprising that its biggest supporters are a cabal of corporations, developers, and tech oligarchs who fund many of the AstroTurf WIMBY groups, many of them in the Bay Area, and are making great strides in moving us ever nearer to an age of neo-feudalism. These are the last people who would have any interest in the kind of measures which would seriously make a dent in income inequality, such as a corporate and billionaire wealth tax that I proposed 5 years ago. Sorry, folks, but this is the kind of progressive solution that would attempt to address the smoking crisis by putting Philip Morris in charge of tobacco control. There are numerous measures that we should take to deal with our housing affordability challenges, none of which involve giving Wall Street developers and Wall Street product developers and marketers the run of our communities. While building more Porsches may not reduce the price of Priuses, building more Priuses might. So if we want more affordable housing, let's build it. That's one of the reasons that I am proud to serve on the La Casa board, and I'm hoping that we can do a lot of good work. We're just in our infancy now. But a massive bond meant for nonprofit affordable housing would be a good start, as would in California the reintroduction of redevelopment with a focus on affordable housing. Redevelopment was a tax increment financing device that cities had to improve blighted areas, and it was taken away by the state, and there were some abuses in fairness, but why? The state wanted the money. Again, it's all about the money. CEQA reform, CEQA was our California Environmental Quality Act, linking job creation to affordable housing construction, a clean up your own mess before you make it provision, would avoid one of the biggest causes of displacement in our problem areas, which is a jobs housing imbalance. That is one area where cities perhaps do need to do a better job. But we need help from the state. Rent stabilization measures in California, starting with repealing the Costa-Hawkins and Ellis Acts, which basically place limits on the kind of rent control that communities are allowed to impose, would be effective tools against displacement and gentrification. But Scott Wiener and the WIMBYs, unconcerned with such solutions or protecting current residents, seem more interested in those who haven't moved here yet. You may have heard from some of the WIMBY groups, we have to think about the people who haven't moved here yet. Again, La Casa, which is the newly founded agency that I serve on, preservation of affordable housing, production of affordable housing, and protection of tenants' rights are important things that we can do, including so-called TOPA and COPA policies. TOPA is if a building is for sale, the tenants have an opportunity to purchase. COPA is the community, but it needs subsidies and it needs funding. Community, we should be supporting and subsidizing community land and community housing trusts. We also need a raft of anti-speculation housing policies, including limiting or taxing Airbnb. We need anti-flipping provisions. We need a vacancy tax, and maybe a foreign owner tax and a speculation tax that could ensure that market rate housing actually comes to the market, while strengthening our state's antitrust laws to preclude the concentration of ownership of real estate. And that might ensure that developments are built to serve the actual needs of people rather than corporate profits. Oftentimes, small is beautiful, and I'm encouraged to note that at the federal level, there are 3 pieces of pending legislation that we should all support. We should all talk to our senators and our congresspeople and tell them. One of them is the Stop Wall Street Landlords Act, which is sponsored by Katie Porter, Ro Khanna, and Mark Takano from California. Sherrod Brown has a Stop Predatory Investing Act, which aims to stop, again, Wall Street ownership, which makes it almost impossible for first-time would-be homeowners to buy a house because they can't compete with all cash offers or the deep pockets of Wall Street or investor groups or algorithms. And then there is one more bill, I believe it is by Senator Merkley, about stop hedge fund ownership of housing. These are all important bills that we should all be supporting. What else can we do? Allowing more regional cooperation in building affordable housing, currently precluded by existing rules in California, would also be an important step forward. Not sure how it works here, though I'm sure Ashley could talk to you about it. But we need to create carrot and stick policies to create economic development in underserved parts of the state and the nation. This would further the goals of creating community-based housing and geographic justice. Again, this is that Swedish concept of the whole country should thrive. And there are so many of these people, these hedge fund people and these big tech people funding these WIMBY groups who look so dismissively and disdainfully on what they call flyover country, the Midwest. I was in St. Louis 2 years ago. It's a wonderful community with tremendous infrastructure. That could be a great place for people to live and raise families, but they need help. Enough with these, again, superstar cities where we're trying to push people, everyone to move to the Bay Area, or where the so-called solution to help the people in Dayton, Ohio is, we'll build enough housing in the Bay Area so they can all move to the Bay Area. Well, I can tell you, I discussed this with, at the time, the mayor of Dayton, Nan Whaley, and she loves her community and she doesn't want them all to move to California or Colorado or anywhere else. This is a national issue and a national problem. Now, we also need to look to increase homeownership, and SCAG, which is a wonderful sounding name, the Southern California Association of Governments, which is a metropolitan planning organization, I serve on one of their committees, has actually just adopted a plan which would focus on increasing homeownership. This is a good thing, and in fact they put in there increasing, because you hear so much about exclusionary zoning and this sort of thing, and it would focus on increasing homeownership for groups that traditionally have been disadvantaged or redlined. The notion that you're going to help them by creating small to mid-size apartments as opposed to allowing these minorities the ability to become homeowners is quite frankly insulting. So again, for these WIMBYs, it's interesting. For the WIMBYs, it's not Wall Street or these predatory investors who are the enemies, it's homeowners. You look at everything they read and they say that homeowners are the enemy and homeowners are the reason that housing is not affordable and homeowners only care about their property values. And that is obviously simply a absurd narrative, and it is not true. We care about our communities, and I think most of us are very inclusive, and we recognize that small to mid-sized dense apartments are not a substitutable living accommodation for a country and people who like having a backyard or a garden, and there's nothing wrong with that. At any rate, the best solutions to our housing affordability challenges don't involve destroying community choice, though they may not strengthen Wall Street's bottom line. Local character and community choice, while oxymoronically decried by progressives, self-styled progressives, who aren't concerned about livability, are wonderful things. The right to self-definition of the individual, at least in theory, is sacred for progressives, and so should it be with communities, which are made up of people. Especially in already dense urban areas like Los Angeles County, which has 10 million people, double the population of the entire state of Colorado, but even of greater Denver. Community gives us a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of home. Community sometimes makes life bearable. But these WIMBY groups don't seem to understand the difference between housing as an investment vehicle, as a speculative commodity, and housing as a place to live, housing as home. Now, we can speculate on where their bitterness and self-entitlement and hubris come from, but we won't do that right now. Community must continue to be our choice if we don't want our cities to become entirely unlivable. So it's time to stop this silly war on single-family housing, single-family neighborhoods, and home ownership. And you'll read in some of these publications, owning a home makes you a bad person. It's a bad investment, except, I guess, for Wall Street. But it's time to stop that war, and it's time for us to embrace something that I would describe as the principle of urban humanism, which allows people to form and join communities which truly reflect the diversity and dynamism of American life at its best. We need everything from Manhattan levels of density to single-family neighborhoods and everything else in between. And just for your information, more than 50% of our residents in Beverly Hills are renters, and over 60% of our housing units are multifamily. But what we don't need is Sacramento or Denver or Washington or the urban planning ideologues within academia to be making decisions for us about the future of our own communities. In a cold, cruel, and sometimes heartless world, community is the solution. It's not the problem. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any of them. Any?
Crystal.
Okay, so builder's remedy, for those of you who don't know, is something which basically says that if a city is not in compliance with this is determined by HCD, our Housing and Community Development Agency, that basically developers can do whatever they want. They don't have to adhere to zoning. Now, it hasn't been tested necessarily in a court yet, but the answer is Sacramento politicians who get most of their funding from real estate interests, developers, big tech, and the urban growth machine. As I said at the outset, we live almost in a plutocracy or a corporatocracy. It's the politicians who are owned and bought by the urban growth machine who have done that, and that is in fact their goal. Now, my feeling is that when some of those projects actually start being built or planned, it will cause a backlash. People who are asleep. Yeah. Right, and again, this is the dream of this is the dream of WIMBYs. They're market fundamentalists. They are radical libertarians. They want to abolish zoning. They want to abolish zoning and quote unquote let the market do its magic. That's their dream. There's nothing progressive about that. But they're trying to, in California, cloak themselves in a mantle of progressivism. But it's the politicians, and it's the builders, lobby group, and the unions are sometimes complicit as well because they look at it as more work. It's, as said, it's a cesspool of political corruption thanks to those two very bad Supreme Court decisions, Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United. That's the root of all of it. Well, I'm calling them, for me, I'm calling them all WIMBYs. I believe they are all motivated. They're not really yes in my backyard. They are ideologically motivated, in some cases with or without financial interest. They have been drinking the Kool-Aid, but the position they are representing is Wall Street in my backyard, because what they are doing is to further commodify housing. They are further turning housing into an investment vehicle rather than as a place to live. And the proof of that is they are unwilling to support what I've described as anti-speculation housing policies. They don't want vacancy taxes. They don't want rent control. They don't want anti-flipping taxes. They don't want to limit corporate investment. They don't want to do any of the things that, in fact, these three congressional bills would do. And interestingly enough, surprisingly enough, surprise, surprise not, on Twitter, a lot of these YIMBYs, or again what I call WIMBYs, oppose them. Because why? It's against their free market fundamentalism.
I have a question about the role of the whole economic development infrastructure in this country that in driving very much of what you outlined, and the fact that it is fundamentally undemocratic. It's pretty much unoversighted. It functions as public-private partnerships at all levels of government, but most governments just don't pay any attention to any kind of oversight. And I'm just about to have a conversation with Brian Check about this because
Brian's great. Brian Check is the founder of CASI and again, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. And I guess the question was about, the undemocratic forces that are pushing economic growth. And, well, again, it comes back to what I initially said. It's all about the money. And this is the problem. Here we are fighting. I think many of us would agree to these anti-speculation housing policies, which, guess what? If we're homeowners, would make our properties actually worth less. But a lot of us would be willing to do that for the stability of our community and because we care about our communities. So the WIMBY narrative that we're just selfish homeowners who only care about our property values is completely false. But the problem is we live in a society where if you try and point out, like that quote about anybody who believes in eternal economic growth is either someone who is what was it?
They're an economist.
Or an economist, or as I said, or a politician. That's the problem. If you question eternal economic growth, you're a Malthusian, you're a misanthrope, you're someone who hates other people, and it's ridiculous because if you care, to me, I would argue that the people who are unconcerned with limits to growth hate this planet. Because we're at 8 billion people and you look at the consumption, and there's something called ecological overshoot day. And that was on August 1st. That was the date at which the Earth used up all of the renewable resources which we can regenerate within a year. I think if you had an annual budget for your household and you spent it all by August 1st, you'd be not in very good shape. And that's where we are as a planet. And unfortunately, everyone is climate change is important, but climate change is a subset of ecological overshoot. And sometimes climate change is an alibi to try and force these fantasies of continued growth. I mean, as said, you should talk to Brian. And Gary and I are trying to get Brian to recognize the urban growth machine as a danger to the future of our planet, because that's what it is. And they can continue to call us names and that sort of thing, but basically, as Cassie points out, they're ignoring the basic laws of thermodynamics. I'm sorry, the WIMBYs are not going to repeal the laws of thermodynamics. But I have said that I do believe that their favorite monarch is Louis XV, who said, après nous, le déluge, after us, the deluge. Who cares what happens after us? There is a bit of that kind of mentality, and there's a whole psychology behind it as well.
But let's take one more, and then we should. Dad, you want to ask the last question?
How did the problem of homelessness get here?
Well, got a couple of things, and it's very interesting. First of all, you stop people from falling into homelessness, and that is where affordable housing is important. But it was interesting, I asked your chief of police here, how much of the homelessness here is people who've fallen on hard times, and how much of it is people who are facing addiction, substance abuse problems, and they said it was like 80% people who have mental health issues or whatever. So housing first, which is what we've heard of, is something that people say, well, it works. Well, housing first is not housing first. Housing without services, wraparound services, will do nothing. So there needs to be a plan to, again, very individually look at each person's case, try and connect with them, try and set them up with services, try and provide them with maybe shelter first or housing first, but housing that includes wraparound services. And there aren't easy solutions. But part of it is, and part of the problem in general, is decreasing income inequality. This country compared to Sweden, the income inequality is outrageous. You've seen probably all of these statistics. 7 people control the wealth of, compared to 90% of the population or something. That just shouldn't happen. It just shouldn't. I'm sorry. There's corporations as well, like Apple, that are sitting on maybe $1 trillion of funds that could be used to help solve the homelessness problem, but also the affordable housing situation. So I think that it's a combination of things, and I think it's very individual, and there aren't any silver bullets. The notion that we just need to allow developers to run riot and upzone everything, and that's going to solve homelessness, is absurd. And in fact, there was a presentation to the La Casa board by someone called Mark Eichenbaum, who works in Houston. And Houston has actually had a lot of success in dealing with homelessness. And he himself said, well, it's, people sometimes say because Houston doesn't have really zoning, that's the reason. And he said, no, that's not it at all. In fact, we had among the worst homelessness problems in the country before we started this program, and we didn't have zoning rules then either. So it's a different approach. And it's not just throwing money at the problem either, because they don't, in Texas, have a lot of public funding to be able to devote. It's a very individualized, where they have people connecting with homeless people and trying to bring them in and providing housing first, which isn't really housing first, and that's why we probably shouldn't use it. Because I asked him that question, he said, no, it's not housing first, like, here's the key, enjoy your new apartment, see you later. No, it's continually monitoring, working with, and trying to provide for the needs of the people. And I do think Houston has a decent model there, but again, there's so many false conclusions drawn by some of these density fetishists that it's just, there's no zoning, and let developers build and it'll all trickle down, and that's a non-solution.
Well, John, thank you so much. I think you've given us a tremendous amount to ponder. Let's give a big round of applause. John came out from California to talk to us tonight. Well, on that note, thank you all so much for coming tonight. This has been a very interesting evening, a lot to ponder. We have a big election season coming up. We look forward to seeing all of you out there. And wish you all a good night. Go Buffs!